Picture a Thursday afternoon in 1963. Your mother is sitting at the kitchen table in Akron, Ohio, or Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or Spokane, Washington. It doesn't matter which state. The scene is exactly the same. She has a cup of coffee going cold beside her, and on the table in front of her is a book. Not a novel, not a Bible, a catalog. 540 pages thick, smelling of fresh ink and possibility. Its cover showing a bright red apple and a family dressed in clothes they haven't yet bought. She circles a pair of ice skates for your birthday. She dog-ears the page with the new Kenmore washing machine. She writes the item numbers on a slip of paper in her careful handwriting, puts it in an envelope, and drops it in the post. 2 weeks later, those skates are on your feet. This is how 100 million Americans lived. This is how Sears, Roebuck and Company reached into the most remote farmhouse in Nebraska, the smallest town in Mississippi, and placed a sewing machine, or a bicycle, or a cast-iron stove, or an entire prefabricated house on the doorstep of people who had no department store within 50 miles and no other way to buy things at a fair price. At its absolute peak, Sears employed 350,000 people. Annual sales reached $10 billion by the early 1970s. In 1969, the company was so large, so dominant, so certain of its own permanence, that it commissioned the construction of the tallest building in the world. The Sears Tower in Chicago rose 1,451 feet and held that title for 25 years. They survived the Panic of 1893. They survived 2 world wars. They survived the Great Depression and actually grew through it. They survived the arrival of the automobile, which transformed shopping and threatened to make their rural mail-order model obsolete. They survived the birth of the shopping mall. They survived the rise of Kmart and Walmart in the 1960s and 1970s. They adapted. They reinvented. They endured. And then, after 132 years of building something unlike anything the world had ever seen, Sears filed for bankruptcy on the morning of Monday, October 15, 2018. How does the largest retailer in the history of the world collapse? What decisions, and which men, actually brought it down? Those 2 questions will be answered before this documentary is over. But the answers are more complicated and more troubling than you might expect. Before we go further, if you are finding this story as fascinating as it is, please take a moment to leave a comment below and tell us what you already know about Sears. Were you a customer? Did someone in your family work there? And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We release new industrial documentaries every week, and this is a story you don't want to be the last to hear. Chapter 1. A Boy at a Station. In 1879, when Richard Warren Sears was 15 years old, his father died. James Warren Sears had been a blacksmith and wagon maker in Stewartville, Minnesota. A man of his hands, a man of modest means who had nevertheless built something solid. Then he made a speculation on farm stock that went wrong, and the fortune he had was gone. 2 years after the loss, he was dead. Richard was left as the man of the family, responsible for his mother Eliza and his sisters, with nothing but his wits and a job at the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad. He started as a telegrapher and station agent. He was posted to North Redwood, Minnesota, a dot on the map, a clapboard station, a platform, a telegraph wire humming in the cold. He was 22 years old, making a few dollars a week, and he had time. Enormous amounts of time between trains, and he had a gift that nobody had taught him, the ability to write words that made people want to buy things. One day in April 1886, a shipment of gold-filled pocket watches arrived at the North Redwood station. The jeweler refused the shipment. The watches sat on the platform, unclaimed. Sears sold the entire shipment in 6 months to fellow railroad agents and pocketed $5,000 in profit. He quit the railroad. He moved to Minneapolis and registered the R.W. Sears Watch Company. Within a year, he had relocated to Chicago, the great rail hub, the center of the country's distribution network. and hired a young watch repairman named Alva Curtis Roebuck to handle the machinery he was now selling in growing quantities. In 1887, Sears published his first catalog, 32 pages, watches, diamonds, and jewelry. Every item backed by a money-back guarantee that no one in the retail trade had ever dared to offer before. The money-back guarantee was not an accident. Richard Sears understood something fundamental about rural America. The hardest thing about buying something by mail is trust. You could not touch the fabric. You could not hear the clock tick. You were sending your money into the unknown. Sears eliminated that risk with a simple promise. If it isn't right, send it back, and we'll return your money in full. No questions. That promise built an empire. Chapter 2. The Wish Book and the Man Who Made It Work. By 1893, Richard Sears and Alva Roebuck had incorporated as Sears, Roebuck and Company. The catalog had grown to 196 pages. It now offered not just watches but sewing machines, saddles, bicycles, shoes, and musical instruments. By 1897, it was nearly 800 pages. But Sears was running out of money almost as fast as he was making it. He was a genius at promotion and a disaster at organization. The orders were flooding in and the warehouse could not keep pace. In 1895, battered by the panic of 1893 and exhausted by the chaos he had created, Alva Roebuck sold his share of the company for $25,000 and walked away. Richard Sears needed someone who could actually run a business. What he found was Julius Rosenwald. Rosenwald was a Chicago clothing merchant, a man of quiet competence and deep moral seriousness. In August 1895, Rosenwald invested $75,000 and became a partner. In 1903, he and Sears bought out a third partner, Aaron Nussbaum, for $1.3 million. In 1906, they took the company public with a $40 million stock offering handled by Goldman Sachs, one of that bank's earliest major deals. In 1908, Richard Sears retired in poor health at the age of 44. Julius Rosenwald became president, and in his hands, the company transformed from a brilliant hustle into a machine. Under Rosenwald, annual sales rose from $750,000 to $50 million. The company built a 3 million square foot campus at Homan Avenue on Chicago's west side. It had its own power plant, its own fire station, 9 miles of pneumatic tubing for inter-office communications, a YMCA for employees, a public library, a cafeteria, a chemical laboratory for testing merchandise. The campus became a self-contained world. Families worked there for generations. Rosenwald also introduced what may have been the company's single greatest competitive weapon: satisfaction guaranteed or your money back. It was Sears's original promise, formalized and stamped on every catalog, every invoice, every page of what the public was now calling, simply, affectionately, the Wish Book. Between 1908 and 1940, Sears sold nearly 75,000 prefabricated house kits through the catalog. You ordered your house the same way you ordered a winter coat. The kit arrived by railway boxcar. Pre-cut lumber, nails, windows, doors, plumbing fixtures, electrical wiring, a boiler, and a set of instructions. The first Christmas catalog was issued in 1933. It featured a Mickey Mouse watch, a Lionel electric train set, live singing canaries, and a doll called Miss Pigtails. Families across the country gathered around it in December as they had once gathered around the family Bible, to look, to circle, to dream. By 1968, when Sears officially renamed it the Wish Book, it was 605 pages long. 225 pages of toys for children, and 380 pages of gifts for adults. This was before Amazon, before the internet, before any of it. Sears had already solved the problem of getting anything you needed delivered anywhere you lived. It was, as historians now say plainly, the Amazon of its day. Chapter 3. The tallest building in the world. By 1925, something had shifted in America. The automobile had arrived, and with it came a new kind of customer. Rural families were now driving into towns. Suburban neighborhoods were spreading out from cities. The catalog was still powerful, but the future was clearly in stores. Sears opened its first retail location in 1925 on its own campus on the west side of Chicago. Within 5 years, it had opened hundreds more. The model worked. Retail sales overtook catalog sales by 1931. Revenues that year reached $180 million, approximately $2.8 billion in today's money. The company introduced its own brands. Craftsman Tools in 1927. Kenmore Appliances in 1927. It launched Allstate Insurance as a subsidiary in 1931. By the 1950s, more than 700 Sears stores were spread across the United States, with additional operations in Canada, Mexico, and Puerto Rico. By 1969, Sears, Roebuck & Company was the largest retailer in the world. Annual sales approached $9 billion. The company employed 350,000 people. Its reach was without precedent in retail history. And in 1969, the company decided it needed a new building. Not just any building. The world's tallest building. The Sears Tower was designed by the architect Bruce Graham and engineer Fazlur Khan. Construction began in 1970. It was completed in 1973. At 1,451 feet and 110 stories, it surpassed the World Trade Center in New York by 100 feet. For 25 years, it was the tallest structure on Earth. Standing at the base of that building in the early 1970s, looking up at its bundled glass tubes disappearing into the cloud cover over Chicago, you were looking at the physical expression of American commercial confidence. But something else happened in 1969 that nobody was paying close attention to. A man named Sam Walton opened his 14th Walmart store in a small Arkansas town, and a company called Kmart was expanding rapidly across the suburban landscape that Sears had spent 50 years cultivating. The warning signs were there. They were ignored. In 1990, Walmart surpassed Sears as the largest retailer in the United States. It is worth pausing on that fact. In 1990, after more than a century of dominance, Sears was no longer number one. And instead of treating that as the emergency it was, the management of Sears spent the next decade doing something extraordinary in its wrongness. They decided to become a bank. Chapter 4. The First Cracks. To understand what happened to Sears in the 1980s, you have to understand what the company thought it was. In the decades of its dominance, Sears had convinced itself that its real asset was not its merchandise, not its supply chain, not its brands, and not its stores. Its real asset, the thinking went, was its customers. 100 million Americans with credit accounts and trust in the Sears name. That was the resource. In 1981, under Chairman Edward A. Brennan, Sears purchased the Dean Witter Reynolds brokerage firm for approximately $600 million. That same year, it bought the Coldwell Banker Residential Real Estate Company. Combined with Allstate Insurance, which Sears had owned since 1931, the company was now the largest financial services company in America by revenue. The tagline they chose, or rather, the one that critics coined for them, captured both the ambition and the absurdity. From stocks to socks. Everything under one roof. Sears opened 280 Dean Witter Financial Services kiosks inside its retail stores between 1981 and 1986. A customer could theoretically walk in to buy a Craftsman drill, arrange a second mortgage through Coldwell Banker, and open a brokerage account, all without leaving the housewares department. What almost nobody knew at the time was that this strategy was already failing within a year of launch. The Discover card, launched in 1985, recorded a loss of over $22 million in 1986. The concept had a fundamental flaw. The average Sears shopper did not want investment advice from a man in a tie standing next to a display of washing machines. Meanwhile, Walmart and Kmart were eating Sears's core business alive. By 1992, Sears posted a loss of $4 billion. It was the company's worst year since the Great Depression. The board of directors hired a CEO from outside, Arthur C. Martinez. He arrived in 1992 and he was appalled by what he found. Everything rose to the top. There was no accountability. From 1992 to 1997, Sears was a success story. The stock rose. The stores were better. Martinez was named CEO of the year in 1996. But when he left in 2000, the stock was almost exactly where it had been when he arrived. The underlying problems, the stores too deeply embedded in dying malls, the brands not keeping pace with Target's design, had not been solved. They had been deferred. Martinez's successor was Alan Lacy. Lacy tried to move Sears off the mall by creating a new format called Sears Grand, a Walmart-style off-mall destination store. It failed. The stores were too expensive to build and too confusing to shop. By 2004, Sears was in serious trouble again. Lacy began looking for a buyer. He found one. And what that man would do to Sears is a story that deserves to be told slowly and precisely, because the details matter. If you've been watching this long, I imagine you've got opinions, maybe even memories. Tell me in the comments, were you a Sears customer in your younger years? What do you remember buying there? I'd love to read your stories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. Tap that button, turn on notifications, and you won't miss the next chapter of this story. Edward Scott Lampert was born in 1962 in Roslyn, New York. He attended Yale University, where one of his dormitory neighbors was Stephen Mnuchin, who would later become the United States Secretary of the Treasury. After Yale, Lampert went to work at Goldman Sachs. He left in 1988 at the age of 25 to start his own hedge fund, ESL Investments, named after his initials, with $28 million in capital. Lampert was brilliant at financial analysis. He had a gift for identifying undervalued assets and extracting value from them. He had made his investors enormous returns through the 1990s. He was, by every financial metric, a success. He understood balance sheets. He did not understand retail. In 2002, Kmart filed for bankruptcy, dragged down by its long war with Walmart and its own operational chaos. Lampert bought Kmart's debt at cents on the dollar. When Kmart emerged from bankruptcy in 2003, Lampert owned 53% of the reorganized company and had made an estimated $900 million on the trade. He became chairman of Kmart Holding. In November 2004, Lampert announced that Kmart would acquire Sears in an $11 billion deal. The combined company was called Sears Holdings. Lampert became chairman of the board. Alan Lacy briefly remained as CEO, but was essentially replaced by Aylwin Lewis as president of operations. By 2008, Lampert himself was CEO. On the day the merger was announced, analysts and retail observers were cautious. Some were openly alarmed. Lampert believed the real estate was worth more than the company. He saw stores, he saw square footage, he saw property values. What he did not see was what a retail store actually needs to function: reinvestment, staff, clean aisles, stocked shelves, an atmosphere that makes a customer want to come back. Jamie Ward of Citizens Bank put it plainly: everyone knows it's the last person you want to work for in retail. He doesn't get retailing. It's been obvious to everyone in the company. Lampert was simultaneously the CEO and the manager of a hedge fund with enormous positions in the company. Every decision he made as CEO directly affected his fund's investments. These were not the same interests as those of the employees or customers. The first years after the 2005 merger produced enough momentum to deceive investors. The combined company had annual revenues of $55 billion. It had more than 3,500 stores. It owned Kenmore, Craftsman, and Die Hard, brands that middle-class Americans had trusted for 50 years. But Lampert was not investing in those brands or those stores. He was extracting from them. Between 2005 and 2015, Sears Holdings spent billions of dollars on stock buybacks, a mechanism that benefits shareholders, particularly large ones. Lampert's hedge fund was the company's largest single shareholder. The buybacks made financial sense for ESL investments. They drained cash that might otherwise have been spent on store renovations, staff training, or competitive pricing. Sears stores deteriorated visibly through the late 2000s. The shelves were sparse. Entire sections of the store were blocked off with yellow caution tape or simply left empty. The lighting was poor. The staff were thin on the ground and increasingly demoralized. While Best Buy renovated its stores to become bright, interactive spaces where you could try the product before buying it, and while Target invested in design that made shopping feel like pleasure rather than obligation, Sears stood still, or rather, it moved backwards. A former Sears executive, speaking on condition of anonymity to a journalist at Fortune magazine in 2021, recalled the atmosphere inside the company during this period. There was a culture of fear. People were afraid to deliver bad news upstairs because bad news was met with blame rather than problem solving. Lampert ran the company from his home in South Florida, mostly via video conference. The gap between what was happening in the stores and what was being discussed in those calls was enormous. In 2013, Lampert reorganized Sears Holdings into 30 separate internal business units, each one effectively competing against the others for resources and attention. The appliances division competed with the tools division. The clothing department competed with the automotive division. Instead of one company working toward a common goal, Sears became a collection of small fiefdoms, each trying to survive at the expense of the others. Retail experts who studied the move compared it to dismantling a building brick by brick while still trying to live inside it. In 2015, Lampert engineered the sale of 235 of Sears Holdings' most valuable store properties to a newly created real estate investment trust called Seritage Growth Properties. Sears then paid Seritage rent to continue operating in the very stores it had just sold. Between 2015 and 2018, Sears paid Seritage approximately $349 million in rent. In 2017, Sears sold the Craftsman tool brand to Stanley Black & Decker for $900 million. The proceeds were used to pay debt, including debt owed to Lampert's hedge fund. Die Hard batteries were put up for sale. In 2016, Kenmore appliances, the anchor of Sears's identity, were placed on the auction block, with Lampert himself making a $400 million bid to acquire them. The irony was almost too large to take in. The CEO of Sears was buying Sears's crown jewels from Sears. The company was being dismantled piece by piece, and the man dismantling it was also the man running it. Monday, October 15, 2018. The United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York received a filing in the early hours of the morning. Sears Holdings Corporation, the parent company of Sears and Kmart, was seeking protection under Chapter 11 of the United States Bankruptcy Code. It filed with approximately 700 stores still operating and 68,000 employees. That number had been 89,000 just 8 months earlier. The bankruptcy filing came on the morning that a $134 million loan repayment was due. A loan from Lampert's own hedge fund. The company did not have the money to pay it. Within weeks, 142 store closure liquidation sales began. The yellow going out of business signs went up in the windows of stores and communities across the country. In shopping malls that had been anchored by Sears for 30 or 40 years, the shuttered storefronts left holes that could not easily be filled. The employees who had worked those stores for decades were entitled to 60 days' notice before mass layoffs. In many cases, they did not receive it. Lawsuits followed. Most workers received far less than they were owed. The retail landscape had changed profoundly. Amazon now sold everything that Sears had once sold. and it needed warehouse workers, not sales floor associates with 30 years of experience. In January 2019, at a bankruptcy auction, Edward Lampert submitted a bid of approximately $5.2 billion through his hedge fund to acquire Sears' remaining assets and keep a smaller version of the company alive. The bid was accepted over the objections of the bankruptcy committee, which argued that it was not in the best interests of creditors and employees. Lampert had just bought, for a fraction of its former value, the company he had spent 14 years running into the ground. The new entity was called Transform Holdco, or Transformco. Under Transformco, the remaining stores continued to close. Die Hard was sold to Advance Auto Parts for $200 million in 2019. The Hoffman Estates headquarters, a campus that once housed thousands of employees, was partly demolished. By June 2025, only 8 Sears retail locations were still operating. By the autumn of 2025, the number had fallen to 5. The Whittier, California store closed in July. The Puerto Rico location announced its closure for August. The Sears Tower, Willis Tower since 2009, still stands in Chicago. It is visited by more than 1 million tourists a year. None of the company's employees work there anymore. Sears moved out in 1994. In 2024, the Hoffman Estates campus, once a monument to corporate ambition, began to be demolished. In its place, developers are building housing units. The original campus on Chicago's west side has been transformed into Homan Square, a mixed-use development. The old merchandise building tower still stands. Most people who drive past it have no idea what it was. You asked, at the start of this story, how the world's largest retailer ends up fighting for its own survival. And you asked what really happened inside those walls. Here is the complete answer. The first part of the answer belongs to the decades before Lampert arrived. Sears's management in the 1970s and early 1980s confused the company's asset, the trust of ordinary American families, with something they could monetize independently of the product. The stocks and socks strategy was not simply a strategic error. It was an act of arrogance, a belief that Sears customers were a resource to be mined, not people to be served. When that strategy failed and took $4 billion with it in 1992, the company had already lost years of investment in its core retail business to competitors who were not distracted. The second part of the answer is Edward Lampert. What Lampert did to Sears between 2005 and 2018 is now studied in business schools as an example of extracting value from a company before it fails. The Seritage transaction is a precise illustration of how a retailer can be systematically gutted. The irony is this: Sears invented the model that Amazon perfected. A centralized warehouse, a vast catalog of goods, delivery to the customer's door. Sears had been doing this since 1888. Within 20 years, Amazon had become what Sears had once been. And Sears was bankrupt. What survives today is a collection of names. The Craftsman brand is sold at Lowe's and Home Depot. The Kenmore brand is licensed to Whirlpool. Die Hard is at Advance Auto Parts. These names no longer mean what they once did. There are men and women in their 70s who worked at Sears for 30 years and carry the memory of it. They knew the stores better than any analyst. They knew what the customers wanted. Nobody ever asked them. The world's largest retailer began with a box of pocket watches in 1886. It ended, not with a dramatic closure, but with a slow, almost inaudible fading in the half-empty aisles of 5 remaining stores in 2025. Clerks standing in silence in the housewares section of malls that were themselves slowly going dark. Now it's your turn. Tell us in the comments what you remember about Sears. We'd like to hear about it.